Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the future of entertainment because I think we see the first cracks, at the very least now, emerging of this woke monolith of entertainment. People are really starting to push back and get tired of it, and I want to talk about what comes next. And I truly believe that woke entertainment is coming to an end. Now, I could give you some individual examples, but I don't think that's necessary. All we have to look at is the fact that if politics is truly downstream from culture, and we see people starting to politically push back against these ideas, then it's a safe bet to make that that has been brewing culturally for some time, and people really do understand in some way why this woke culture is dangerous, and the normal person is ready, or probably already has started, to push back against this in a cultural sense. And our entertainment is part of the culture. Now, I don't think this woke entertainment is going to go silently into the night. No, they're going to have to be dragged out kicking and screaming, but that's a subject for another video. And before I start, I just want to say that I'm going to do sort of what I usually do, which is to give you an argument about what is going on here, to try to be as rational as possible, but I'm also going to add a little bit of my own, and I hate to use this phrase, but artistic interpretation of what is going to come next. And I hate to use that phrase because I don't see myself as an artist. I don't even see myself as an author, even though I have now one book self-published and another one on the way. And by the way, if you ordered my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, from Indiegogo, all of those orders have now been fulfilled. If you have not received your book yet, you should check the email that you use with Indiegogo to see if you got a confirmation for it being sent. And it may still be in the mail because some of the international orders take at least 30 days to get to people. But back to what I was saying. I don't really see myself as an author. Really, I see myself as a storyteller. That's about it. I don't think an author and a storyteller are the same thing. And I always wanted to be someone who told stories and made money from telling stories. But actually, the opposite is what happened with my life. Out of necessity of one kind or another, I became a businessman, even though it's a small business, and made that money first, so much so now that I can take my time and write stories. And I say that specifically because I'm not an author who makes money off of his stories. I'm a businessman who makes money by telling stories. And those are two different things. And so when I'm actually writing a story, I do think about what people want right now, give them what they want so this thing can sell. Yes, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take that into consideration. And so I'm going to write stories which I believe is what people want, not just now, but in the near future. What the future of storytelling is, I want to be ahead of the game, and this is why I'm talking about what comes next within storytelling. But in order to do that, first we have to look at where we are right now and where it has come from. And I want to focus on two authors specifically in order to show this. Now, as usual, I'm going to use comic books and graphic novels as my base of entertainment that I'm describing, but these two authors certainly have great influence not only on publications outside of comics and graphic novels, but on television, movies, and other kinds of entertainment as well. Because these two authors would be Frank Miller and Alan Moore. Frank Miller, who wrote the story that most people would know of the 300, or I really should say, interpreted the story in the way that we all know it right now, and Alan Moore being the person who wrote the story of Watchmen. Now, one of these authors is a great storyteller, and the other one can tell great stories. And yes, those are two different things. Also, I'm going to use the broadest strokes imaginable when I talk about this, and I don't think these two people are the source of all of what I am going to say, but they are great examples, I think some of the highest examples of what their contemporaries were also doing. So what I think Frank Miller exemplifies within entertainment, and very much so at the height of comic books and graphic novels, is the change from a plot-driven story to a character-driven story. This is what Frank Miller brought into comics and graphic novels, specifically, I would say, starting with his Daredevil run, which I read off of the spinner rack, and then moving into his Dark Knight Returns with Batman and Superman, which again, I read off the shelf of the comic store. Before that, most comics were comics where you had action and adventure. Yes, there was a lot more talking in those old comics. Trust me, I read old comics and new comics next to each other. It always hits me in the face when I go from a new comic to an old comic to see just how much dialogue there is in an old comic as compared to a new one, which is kind of bizarre considering what I'm going to be talking about. But the point really being that in those old comic stories, you had action and adventure. That's what it was for the most part. Sure, you would get a little bit of introspection from the character at the end. Usually it would be on the last panel or sometimes the last page. You would see them being a little bit reflective and then the story would end. All of that inner reflection that you would normally get within a character-driven story is all done off screen, because you concentrate on the plot within the stories themselves, and then you can give action and adventure to your audience. So to take a step back just for 1 second, for those who are not really familiar with the terms, a character-driven story is a story that deals with the inner transformation of your character or the relationships between the characters within the story, whereas a plot-driven story usually focuses on a set of choices that the person has to make, and it is a concentration on those choices that A, gets him to make specific other choices and then drives the entire plot along. But Frank Miller, I think, at the very least, with his early Daredevil work and in The Dark Knight Returns, focuses on a character-driven story, or at the very least opens the door to great character-driven stories, because that's what those stories, in my opinion, really are. It is an internal exploration of who Matt Murdock and Bruce Wayne are, and why each of those characters are, in their alter ego, a hero. And there was, to some extent, a certain little bit of deconstruction of those characters within the stories of Frank Miller, but I don't think there was that much. But it was the concentration on a character-driven story from that point in time, which he exemplifies, which is what we see within storytelling for the last almost 40 years now. Just to give you one example of a fad that was terribly influential and based upon character-driven stories, you look at the whole YA novel craze that has died down by this time, which I talked about in my last video. Those stories were, for the most part, character-driven stories, focusing on a first-person telling of what is going on and their internal reactions and changes and relationships with other characters. Now, I'm not saying that first-person or character-driven stories are bad. I, myself, in the novel that I have written, which, as I keep on saying, I hope to get published at some point, it is a first-person, character-driven storyline. Now, you're not going to find that within the stories I'm going to write for graphic novels and comics, but that's what it was, and I think it has its place. But I really think people are now sick of that kind of storytelling. And that brings me to Alan Moore. Alan Moore would be the person who can write a great story. Now, I say that specifically because he can, but he does not, in my estimation. I will not hide the fact that I do not like Alan Moore, nor do I like most of his stories. Now, yes, I read his early stories for comics, which would be his early Captain Britain stories that were published in the Captain Britain magazines, which were black and white. I have those in my collection as well. Those stories, his early stories, did intrigue me, but at the same time, I don't think that was the apex of those characters, even though he was the one who created most of those characters in their current form and the storytelling in its current form for those characters. Quite honestly, I think that the run that came after that with those characters, which would be the Alan Davis run within Excalibur, was the high point for those characters. And it was because Alan Moore's stories with those characters was just too dark for me. Whereas Alan Davis's were quite light and did have darkness in them, but also very light parts to them as well. But the thing to understand about Alan Moore is that at his core, he is a subversive. And that's what he puts down on a page. And that's why he can write a good story, but in my estimation, doesn't really do that. Why? Because what he wants to do is to subvert both culture and storytelling. And he does that by breaking stories and by breaking culture, and he usually does those two things by breaking a character. And in doing so, he's not telling an actual good story. He knows exactly what a good story is. As has been expressed by many people before me, the only way that you can properly break a rule is if you know exactly what that rule is to begin with. And I think this is Alan Moore to a T. He knows exactly how to tell a great story. I think that comes from I would probably estimate his classical education, or much more closer to a classical education than people get today. And so he knows very well how to masterfully tell a great story, but he doesn't because he wants to subvert the story. So I think that Alan Moore didn't so much take his hint from Frank Miller, but that he was working along the same lines as Frank Miller, and when Frank Miller opened the door to character-driven plots, Alan Moore took those character-driven plots and put an extra layer on top of that, which was subversion of story and culture itself. And as I said, he needs to put one on top of the other because what he does is to subvert both the story and culture at the same time by breaking the character. And he can break the character much better in a way where it is a character-driven plot. Now, I'll just give you my interpretation, my argument of why I think that Alan Moore can write a good story, but he doesn't. And I don't like Alan Moore's stories. It's because they're not really stories. Now, I look at stories and I define them in the ancient way, and really that is the way that Western civilization has viewed stories up until about 80 years ago. And it's based upon an Aristotelian view of what a story is. A story is a rhetorical argument. A rhetorical argument meant to do what? Well, it's a rhetorical argument meant to entertain you. That is to say, it's meant to delight you. That's what Aristotle would say. And how does it delight a person? Well, it delights a person by giving them a representation of reality. And we are delighted by a representation of reality because we're imitative learners. And to some extent, as I'm always saying, it harkens back to a childlike wonder of exploration of representations of reality, which is how we learn as children. And so we are delighted by storytelling because we're delighted by representations of things. But here's the thing. The representation of a thing needs to be a representation of reality in order for that to actually hold. Because if a story is defined as a rhetorical argument that gives us delight through a representation of reality, and you remove one of those things, it becomes something other than a story. Now, it remains a rhetorical argument, but it becomes a rhetorical argument that is something else. It is a rhetorical argument used as a didactic or a teaching tool, which is what you see around you today in most stories. But with Alan Moore, it becomes something different. It becomes a part of subversion. So it still is a rhetorical argument for him, but because he doesn't represent reality in the way that it actually is, it's not a real story. It's a subversion of what a story is in order to draw in an audience. And that's exactly what he's doing. And that's exactly what he always does. It would actually be more akin to what Aristotle would call a comedy than anything else, really, because a comedy is a representation of something that is grotesque, and you have no other choice but to laugh at it. Whereas within Alan Moore's stuff, it's grotesque, but it doesn't make you laugh. It's grotesque in order to make you draw back in horror, and you start to look at it like you would rubberneck at a traffic accident as you drive by. And the reason why I don't think he gives you an accurate representation of reality is, as I have just said, because he focuses almost entirely on the dark side of reality, and that's it. For his stories, sure, you might find a glimmer of light in there somewhere, but mostly he presents to you a reality which is nothing but the dark side of reality. And that, in my estimation, is not a representation of what reality is. It's only a representation of what half of reality is, at best. For me, I would say reality, I'm looking around it in my own life, and there is a light side to it, and there is a dark side. And if you want to represent reality down on the page, those two things need to be there at the same time. If you don't, if you do like Alan Moore and concentrate only on the dark side, it's not an actual representation of reality, only a partial representation of reality, which then does not delight, it horrifies, and that's his rhetorical argument, which again makes that rhetorical argument something other than a story. But I have to admit, this is masterfully done. Why? Because Alan Moore, in my estimation, is not a true subversive. He's someone who plays at being a subversive in order to invoke that horror in people, in order for his books to sell. Quite simply, that's all he does. I think that's why you don't see much from Alan Moore anymore. Why? Because he played at being almost crazy in order to horrify people with his stories, in order for those stories to sell. But today, you look around you, on the streets, in your government, anywhere, you'll see these quote-unquote woke people, and they are, in my estimation, many of them anyways, are literally crazy. These people are, to some extent, insane. A lot of them, in my estimation, belong in a padded cell. And so you can't outdo crazy by pretending to be crazy. And Alan Moore simply pretends to be crazy. He's not actually that way. And to give you some examples of his subversion, if you look back at those old Captain Britain stories, this is where you get the term of the Marvel 616 universe. He came up with that term. Now for him, why did he choose that? And why did he use that specific moniker to describe the main reality of the Marvel universe? Well, he did it to be subversive. Why? Because in his reading, he found that some people would, in older text, refer to the mark of the beast as 616. And that's why he did it. He was actually putting a satanic, literal for him, a satanic message into those stories. And we still use it today to describe the main version of the Marvel Universe, which is 616. And he did that to subvert. He did that to shock people. That's why he would do things like in the 80s, he would walk around with t-shirts that had a hammer and sickle on them. This was a time of a great anti-communist sentiment, and he would walk around with communist symbols on his chest. Or when he, in the 90s, wrote that book, I think it was the 90s, where he had, and I'll try to be delicate, he had underaged female characters doing adult things. This is why he does all of this, to be a subversive. But again, I don't think he actually is a subversive. He's an armchair subversive. Let's look at one of these. Let's look at his promotion of communism. Alan Moore seems to present himself as a communist and someone who is in support of communism. But in my estimation, the reason why Alan Moore would present himself and did present himself as a supporter of communism was to shock people in order to get them to buy his books, in order for him to make more money, in order for him to be a good capitalist. And why am I going so deep into this? Well, I'm going so deep into this because, again, what you've seen for almost the last 40 years is people trying to copy Alan Moore. They want to write a character-driven story and be a subversive. But here's the thing. Alan Moore, as I said, was able to generate that controversy by subverting culture, by subverting storytelling, by breaking his characters. And this is specifically how he did things. And he was able to do that by masterfully understanding what a story actually is and then breaking the rules of storytelling. So, for example, with Watchmen, he would take these characters that looked like other characters that certainly looked superhero-like, and that would, at the very beginning, invoke in the mind of the reader all of the tropes that come along with superheroes. And then he would take where that would lead the mind of a normal reader and break that over his knee in front of them by breaking the character. That would then shock the audience, which then, with his masterful manipulation of the audience, would promote a subversion of the culture itself. And as I said, you have so many authors, some of which probably never even heard of Alan Moore before, trying to do the exact same thing that he put down on a page over the last 40 years. But the problem being, more and more as time went on, these people were actual subversives. They weren't like Alan Moore, pretending to be a subversive. They were actual subversives, and they really wanted to subvert culture. And so, as such, they didn't care nor really understand what an actual story is. And therefore, when they tried to break the rules, they can't do it properly. There is an attempt over and over again to break characters. We see this all the time in comics, and really in much of our entertainment that deals with established characters. They're just trying to break them over and over again, and they're trying to break them in order to make a political message, in order to enact some kind of political change. But the point is, since they don't know how to tell a good story, they don't know the basic rules of storytelling, they can't actually use the process as Alan Moore himself masterfully used the process. And it becomes nothing more than a ham-fisted propaganda machine. Whereas Alan Moore's, at the very least, was a well-crafted, delicate touch propaganda machine. But honestly, as I said, is really only done in order to make him money. And so, my entire point to concentrate on all of this is the fact that since people are getting sick of woke entertainment, as I would assert, because they're getting sick of it politically, and culture drives politics, therefore they must have already gotten sick of this in a cultural fashion and are ready to abandon it, they're also sick of all of the things that are tied up with this propaganda machine that disguises itself as storytelling right now. And those things would be not just subversion and deconstruction of a character itself, but character-driven stories themselves. So the question then becomes, what is going to come next? And as I said, as a businessman who wants to sell stories, I'm looking at what people want right now. And so I'm going to give you a description of my own kind of storytelling in order to give you an idea of what I believe is going to come next as a reaction to this rejection of deconstruction, subversion, and character-driven plots. Because quite honestly, I see what I am doing is starting from almost the exact same point as Alan Moore, but moving in the exact opposite direction from where he was moving. And before I give you any more, I have to say, I want to thank everyone who gave even a comment, and especially those people who gave a review of my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant. Yes, even those people who gave a negative review. All of those things were immensely helpful for me to crystallize down in my own thoughts what exactly my stories are. Now, I knew exactly what kind of story I wanted to tell, but this, really, the audience reaction helped me boil it down to exactly what it is. And I'm going to examine my own story mostly through the criticisms of it, but also through some of the praise of it as well. Now, my own story, I'll have to say, there are very few people that I've interacted with talking about my story who just said, it's okay. Most people either really, really liked it or really hated it. Most people really, really liked it. And I'm very glad for that. It shows that I'm going in the right direction. But one of the major complaints that I got from some people about the story was that my story was just bad fan fiction because I was just taking copies of existing characters that you could tell who they were and writing a story about them. And I would say, yeah, that's actually what I'm doing. That's a valid complaint if you want to make a complaint about it. For me, I don't see that as being something to complain about. Because number one, I'm looking at these characters, these Marvel and DC characters, and I know that those characters have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of good stories left in them. But Marvel and DC is never going to tell those stories again. For characters like Batman and Superman, who are going to become public domain characters within about 10 years, there is no way that I can see of DC actually rejuvenating those characters after all of the destruction they have caused to them over the last 10 to 15 years before they become public domain. So those great stories about Superman and Batman are never going to be told by DC again. So I'm going to tell those great stories in characters that are very similar, and they're meant to be very similar to those characters. Now, am I giving my audience nothing but bad fan fiction? Well, if you want to call it that, okay. But it's just the exact same bad fan fiction as Marvel gave to people when they created the Squadron Supreme, which was just a copy of the Justice League characters. It's just the same bad fan fiction as DC when they created their Dark Matter characters, or the characters became known as the New Age of DC heroes, like Sideways and those other characters, which were DC copies of Spider-Man, the Hulk, Ghost Rider, etc. And it's just the same kind of bad fan fiction when Alan Moore took those old Carlton characters that he wanted to use and tell a story about and made them into the Watchmen. Alan Moore wanted to tell a story about characters that he felt something, a connection to, but he wasn't able to use those characters, so he decided to make his own version of those same characters and tell the story that he wanted to tell. And quite honestly, when I picked up from the comic shelf Watchmen and started to leaf through it, I gently put it back on the shelf because I knew it was not for me. So I didn't know very much about Watchmen when I eventually got to watch the movie, because back then I just watched every movie. And when I watched it, I was able to pick out as a comic fan that, yeah, this is just Blue Beetle. Yeah, this is just Captain Atom. I knew that in my mind. but they were different characters, different enough so that you are able to understand that they were the same characters, but different. And that's exactly what I try to do with my characters. I am using characters that are similar enough to something that's going to spark in your mind, because what I usually do is I take one DC character and one Marvel character, and then I squish them together into one unique character, which is close enough so that it sparks in your mind that, yeah, this is just this character. That's purposefully done. Why? Because I want to do the exact same thing. Not only tell great stories that no longer can be told within the main storylines of these characters, but I want to, as Alan Moore did, use those tropes to already bring into your mind a whole set of preconceived notions about a superhero story and these characters in particular. But, unlike Alan Moore, I'm not going to go on to break those characters. And here's really what I see my stories as being. They are a superhero version, and the next one, which is CROM the Destroyer, it is going to be a fantasy version of a man with no name Western. Or I guess I should say spaghetti Western, but I'll just call it man with no name Western, even though that's only really true for, I think, a fistful of dollars, a few dollars more, and the good and the bad and the ugly. And that brings me to the next criticism of my books. The criticism was that I don't give any backstory for these characters. I don't give any real backstory for this world. It's just jump right into it, and what do you expect me to fill in the blanks myself? Yes, I do expect you to fill in the blanks yourself. Why? Because it's a man with no name Western. What happens in a man with no name Western? You have a character. You know nothing of this character. You don't know anything about his backstory. You don't even know his name. You simply know he's a cowboy. Why? Because he's wearing a cowboy hat and cowboy boots and has a 6-shooter on his hip. So you know he's a cowboy. So all those tropes, all those preconceived notions come into your head about what a cowboy is. And you fill in all of those blanks. And since you can fill in all of those blanks, the simple basic story of a man with no name Western is a guy wanders into town. You know he's a cowboy. In this town, bad things are happening. So when he gets there, stuff hits the fan. And that's your plot. And here's the thing about man with no name Westerns. They really only became a subgenre of Westerns and could only do so in the very specific time that they emerged, which was the very late 50s and the 60s. Why? Because what you had prior to that is so many great Western tales. Westerns were everywhere. They were on the radio. They were on your television. They were on the movie screen. They were in your comic books. There were paperback novels about Westerns out your ears everywhere. And people were getting sick of Westerns at that point. Why? Because they already knew what was going to happen within the stories. And so they already had all of these preconceived notions of what a cowboy is in their minds. Not just every American, not just every American kid, but even foreigners were inundated with so many of these stories that you got spaghetti Westerns, which is to say you had these foreigners making Western tales. And so, yes, even these foreigners who weren't American knew the exact details about all of the tropes of being a cowboy, and so they were able to make movies out of them. Now, to some extent, I do see those man with no name Westerns as being a deconstruction of a Western tale, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I'm going to focus on is what I just said. You see, since those tropes were so well understood by people, since they looked at this character, even without a name and a backstory, they saw in the getup that he was in that he was a cowboy, and so their mind would automatically go to the idea that, well, all of the tropes of a cowboy actually play in here. And so he's probably a bit of an SOB, but he has a heart of gold. And if he meets up with some woman that's in trouble, he's going to probably save her in the end. He's going to come into this town and bad things are happening, and he's just not going to stand for it. You know all of these things just by the fact that you know it's a Western. And so what Man with No Name Westerns were able to do was to cut to the chase. To cut out all of that stuff that would be boring people at that time about a cowboy story, because they've already known it, they've already gone through it, experienced it, read it, saw it on the movie screen so many times, they've already experienced what the backstory of those tales actually were, so you could cut out that part and just cut to the chase. And further to that, allowing them not just to cut to the chase, but allowing them to build upon all of those understood tropes of what a cowboy and a cowboy story is in order to tell a more detailed story that involved many different subplots and many different things that you didn't know exactly what was going on. Where is this going? How does this figure into what the plot is? All of those kinds of intricate parts of a story that make those movies so good. And that's exactly what I wish to present to you, the audience, for multiple reasons. I want to be the guy who's known as giving you a graphic novel that is pedal to the metal, foot to the floor, action and adventure with a little bit of drama right from the beginning, almost all the way through to the end. Sure, I might have to step off the gas a little bit for some deep turns, but that's what you're going to get. And I can give you that because why? Because we are in the exact same position right now as the late 1950s and 1960s, where they were getting sick of these cowboy stories because everyone knew all of the tropes. We are in that exact same position right now with superhero stories and to a lesser extent with fantasy stories. I know people, and I'm sure you probably know the same kind of people as well, who have never picked up a comic book in their life and never will pick up a comic book in their life. But because superhero stories are so much part of the culture right now, they know all of the superhero tropes nonetheless. It is ingrained not just within American culture, over-ingrained right now, but even within foreign cultures themselves. So everybody understands all of these tropes, so I don't need to give my characters some large backstory. I don't need to give those characters even a name sometimes, because just like the Man with No Name Western, I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm going to give you exactly what you want. I'm going to give my audience the best bang for their buck that they can get. Why? Because, of course, people have been getting sick and tired of this character-driven kind of story. This character-driven kind of story where they spend the first 5 to 10 pages or the first 5 to 10 minutes exploring the backstory of this character, his tragic past, and all of these things. People are sick of this kind of storytelling. They already know all of this. They already know where this is coming from. They already know where it's going. Why include it? You're actually giving them an inferior product right now if you do include it. I want to give you exactly what you crave because you've been missing it for the last 40 years, which is pure action adventure. And as with those old Man with No Name Westerns, I can use that basis of action and adventure in order to tell a more intricate kind of story within the pages themselves. And just like those Man with No Name Westerns, is it all going to make sense right at once? No, it isn't. Is it all going to play together so that you know how each part fits into the plot right away? No, it isn't. Why? Because I can tell a more intricate story by using that basis of you already understand part of the story. And that gives you, the audience, something else that has been missing within your storytelling for quite some time. I would call it a form of interactive storytelling. That is to say, I'm giving you characters that look like other characters that you know. So your brain automatically goes to all of the superhero tropes. And then you look at these characters and go, that character looks like this character. Then it adds another layer of giving you all of the tropes for that character. So you are providing some of the story yourself for what you are reading, and so it's an interactive kind of story that allows you to think for yourself and pick out and understand what is going on for yourself. And again, I would say people are hungry for that right now, because what you get right now is either propaganda or a didactic story that is trying to tell you what to think. It is not in any way allowing you to think for yourself. But my story is allowing you not only to think for yourself, but to participate in the storytelling at some basic level, which is exactly what the Man with No Name Westerns did with their stories. And by the way, just a little caveat for all of those people who want some actual definition of who these characters are and why this world is the way it is. I myself did the old thing that the Marvel and DC Comics did when they had plot-driven stories. They didn't give you all of that in those old 80s and earlier comics. They give you plot-driven stories, and they didn't give you this massive explanation of it. So what did they do for those people who wanted to see those things? Well, they published things like Marvel Universe or DC's Who's Who, which would just give you a wall of text in order to understand all of these basic facts about the character for the people who wanted that. And actually, I provided that with my campaign as well. Now, it wasn't in the main book because I don't think those things need to be in the main book. Again, I think that is taking away from the bang for your buck that you want as someone who is craving action and adventure. I gave it as a side addition to those things which Marvel and DC did with their Who's Who or their Marvel Universe. I gave it on the cards that I created. I gave it on the map, which came with an in-world letter explaining why the map in the world is the way that it is. So those things are there, but those things are there as an afterthought for those people who want that extra bit, because I don't think they're needed in the story. I don't think they're wanted in the story. I think the people want, again, what they've been craving. And I've seen this within the comments of people commenting on my story. Because if you're someone who was born prior to the 80s, you understand what good stories used to look like. But I got comments, especially one specific comment where a guy said, "Look, I'm someone who was born in the 90s. I hear what you're saying all the time on your channel, and I understand that what I'm looking at is not a good story, but I could not figure out what the difference really was between these kinds of stories and the older kinds of stories that you're always referring to. But with your book, I now see exactly what you mean." So the point being that people who are born after the 80s, they don't really have a connection to these true great stories that are something other than a lesson, that are something other than propaganda, and that are something other than character-driven stories. And so we have an entire generation who are just hungry for these kinds of things. That's why I think that this is the future of entertainment. This kind of man with no name Western. This kind of story which is just pure action and adventure. These kinds of stories which are plot driven, not character driven. That is the future of entertainment. And also, I believe that being a hero, being heroic, that is also within the future of entertainment. And that's why I said I want to start from basically the same place as Alan Moore, but move in the opposite direction. Whereas Alan Moore took all of those preconceived notions and then horrified the reader by breaking them over his knee and then sold a story that way, I want to take all of those preconceived notions that everyone has about superheroes and these specific superheroes, and then show you exactly why you think of them that way, and explore exactly why those tropes come to your mind. And this leads me to the last great complaint that some people have about my story. They listen to me every week on this channel talking about heroes as a paragon of virtue, and they look at my story and go, I don't see a paragon of virtue there. They don't really see a hero within my story, and so they don't like my story because of that. Well, first off, I'll have to say that, number one, that's like saying, I don't like Spider-Man because within the first story ever published about Spider-Man, he wasn't a very good hero before he received his pathos. Well, that's kind of exactly the point of pathos, is that you make some mistakes and then you suffer for it, and then you develop a pathos which allows you to become who you are in the future. And so for those people who probably thought I was going to write something like a Superman story, no, I'm not a DC guy. I'm a Marvel guy. I'm going to write Peter Parker. I'm going to write Matt Murdock. I'm going to write Logan, because these people are people. They are an accurate representation of reality. They show a light side and a dark side to who they are. And they get pushed to the ground by the circumstances of their life. And that really is the difference between a hero and a villain. A villain gets pushed to the ground by reality and decides he's simply going to stay in the dirt where he thinks he belongs, where the world tells him he belongs, and he's just going to curse the world. But a hero gets pushed to the ground and he learns something from that humiliating experience. That is what humility itself is supposed to point to. The word itself comes from close to the ground. So when that person gets pushed to the ground, they say, okay, reality has now taught me an important lesson. Time to get back up. So not only is that the kind of hero story that I'm going to write, a hero story where their foot slips, where they keep on making mistakes and use those mistakes in order to get back up after being pushed to the ground, but I'm doing that for my audience as well. Because you, as an audience, with this propaganda that has been pushed in your face for so long, with these didactic kinds of stories, with these character-driven plots, which you can't get away from. You've been pushed to the ground over and over and over again by the culture. And just like in these stories, I think it is time for the readers of stories to say, no more. I don't belong here in the dirt. It is time for me to rise up and stand against those people who have pushed me to the ground. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.